questions.
Just like I said, I'm losing my voice a little bit. So if I need to get another drink, I'll just mute myself and get up. So if I disappear, that's where I am. I can still hear you.
No, that's fine. And we'll, you just, since you're the guest, you only need to speak about 80% of the podcast.
Okay.
So it's,
That is not hard once you get me going. It'll be nonsensical, but it'll.
Most unlikely of villains, schools of blame and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? Let on the cerebral bore. And I'll show him so much more. We'll leave your brains at the door.
Welcome back to Cerebrivore. I'm Jason of Nerds RPG Variety Cast. I've got a wonderful panel for you with me today. We have Carl, the Geomologist Presents, BJ of the Arcane Alienist, and a special guest, Daniel Norton, of the Bandits Keep Media Empire. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Doing great.
Doing well.
Doing good.
Great. Today we are going to talk about the idea of running a pre-written module compared to running a homebrew module. And there's no right or wrong answers here, but we're just going to kind of talk some experiences we've had and that. I do think, this is me kind of flexing my muscles here a little bit since I'm kind of the moderator here. I do think there's value, even if you only ever run homebrew. I think there's value to reading pre-written modules. You get to see what the game designer, especially the ones that come with games, although some introductory adventures are pretty horrible, but modules by the company that made the game, because you kind of see what they want the system to do, especially with a leveled game at different levels. So I think there's value to reading them, but I don't necessarily know that you have to use pre-written modules. But I think what we're going to open up with is an easy question, and that's going to be, just, kind of briefly, do you prefer to run pre-written modules or you prefer to do your own thing? And we're going to throw it to our guest first. So I'm going to give the mic over to Daniel.
Oh, okay. Hey, sure. That's an interesting question. I would say that I like to start campaigns with pre-written modules and then homebrew from there. So I like them as a starting point. It helps establish a little bit of the way we want to go. Kind of, you want to have a little bit of a path for the players in the beginning to kind of set the direction of the campaign. So I think that helps to have something pre-written up front.
Okay. I think that makes sense. Let's go to BJ next.
For me, it kind of comes and goes. I tend to run for pre-written modules just because, for expedience sake, because I don't have a whole lot of time to write. But then every now and then I'll get some kind of inspiration of, I have a really cool idea for a campaign adventure, and then I'll write my own. It kind of goes back and forth. It's been a couple of years since I did kind of anything completely homebrewed, but I also tend to deviate quite a bit from what's in the published module. I will, whatever the narrative is presumed, I will usually throw that out the window and create my own, kind of draw inspiration from what's there and saying, well, here's where the dungeon is and here's where the town is and here are kind of the monsters that are milling about. I'll kind of rewrite my own reasons and plot lines for them being there for people to interact with, as opposed to just sticking with whatever the author had in mind.
Excellent. Yeah, I tend to do that as well. Carl.
Yeah, I much for the same reasons BJ outlined. It's a time thing, and it does take some intellectual investment to come up with your own thing. That's why, a pre-written module, just in theory, you should be able to just read it and then run it. So there might be some prep if you're using VTT or whatever, if you need to, understand how monsters work or spells work, but it's a lot easier than coming up with your own thing. So I think pre-written modules tend to be what I do the most. But I've had some great experiences with homebrew, so it's not like I don't run the homebrew, and I do enjoy it, but I think it's a time thing for me now.
I would also add, kind of as an afterthought, that it kind of depends on what players I'm playing with, because I've got several people I play with that form into different groups and clusters, depending on who's available for what time. And, sometimes you just think they're not going to have any more fun if I come up with something completely new that they've never seen before versus if we just run generic dungeon crawl 37. And if there's not going to be any more, and I know that's not a criticism of it, that's just like, if they're really not going to get anything out of me putting all this effort in, I might as well just run something out of a module.
But, I think that's interesting that you both said that, because I actually think it's easier for me anyways to write and run my own thing than a module. Because usually my adventures are like a paragraph and 6 bullet points. Like that's when I'm writing something. So I'll be listening to a story or reading a short story, and I'll just be like, that's an adventure. They need to get this gem. It's in this mountain. There's these 5 bad guys, and I'll just note them down. And that's the adventure for me. When I read a module, I have to know, hold on, does this guard in this first room know that something's upstairs, based on what the module says? So I find that actually more prep.
I think that's interesting. And yeah, I took advantage of Daniel having to cough there a little bit off mic. But sorry, we're honest for other viewers here on Cerebral. But I can do the same thing. I don't have it handy. I run out of a GM journal, an actual book journal, and I do that even when I'm running online games. I keep my notes in the journal and stuff, and I'll mark things down. And I'm the same way. I find I much prefer homebrew over published adventures. I've had some great times running. I've had some great experience with published adventures, but for the most part, I definitely prefer to do homebrew. I took advantage. Or did you have anything else you want to add there, Daniel?
No, that was I squeezed it in. I was had to cough that. Yeah, I do the same thing. Like I think that the reason why I say that so when I'm starting a campaign, I don't mind spending half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, whatever, 2 hours to read through a module and get like an idea of something. So we're going into it. Then once I'm going session to session, I don't want to have to keep reading that. And if I'm homebrewing, I don't usually have to. When I end each session, I just make a few notes for myself of where people are, and then I can usually just keep going. But of course, if you don't come up with something that day, that can be pretty hard too. So I suppose there is that. I think mentally or creatively, it's harder to come up with a homebrew. But I think prep wise, for me anyways, it's faster. But I also run super light games where I don't need, to like do monster stats and stuff. I could just be like a frogman. Yeah, that's 2 hit dice and be done. Like I don't have to go beyond that.
That's a huge advantage, like using ICRPG, right? And I'm not pushing a certain system, but with ICRPG, because you have room target numbers and your monsters are effectively, X number of hearts and this and that. It's super easy to do. But I do it even with heavier things like Cyberpunk 2020. That was all homebrew. That what I was running for you guys. But we'll talk about this later on. Let's I don't want to jump ahead of the questions I gave you guys. So let's actually switch to our first question here. Now that we've broken the ice, let's talk about the best experience we've had with a pre-written module. Either one that we've run, the pre-written module we ran that went the smoothest, or maybe one that you played in. It's totally up to you. And we'll go reverse order. So we'll throw it to Carl first.
Yeah, I think this is pre-written, right? The first best pre-written. I think the best pre-written experience that I've had, because I'm a completist and I really hate starting long campaigns and never finishing them. So I think that the Starfinder, I think it was the first adventure path that they created for Starfinder. I think it was called Dark Suns, and we actually started with the box set, the starter set for Starfinder. It's like there's an adventure in there, and then ran right into the first book in the adventure path, and we finished all 6 of them, which is a huge accomplishment. But it went really well. I think that adventure path was put together really very well. I would say Paizo, after a million adventure paths, I've learned their lesson on how to introduce the villain early on and just make more powerful members of that one villain or villain group. And I think it had a very satisfying, I would say, Star Wars-esque finale on a ship that's, falling apart and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very satisfying, had a great group who were dedicated and really got into their player characters. And I think we had great conclusion. One of these days, I mean, they actually have like a sequel to it too, where you play higher level versions of these. Well, the level that you achieved at the end of this, I think they were like 16th to 17th level, pretty freaking high when the 20 is the cap, right? So, it was a really good experience. So I really do like Starfinder, and it's a great system to run, and mainly because I had that experience with that first adventure path.
Very cool. BJ.
Just kind of sticking with the pre-written module as it was written, I think the one I probably had the most fun with is the Salt Marsh series. I ran that several years ago, and there's a reason a lot of people like it. It's a neat setting with a neat plot line run along in the background, and again, because it's a classic, TSR first edition Gygaxian style module. I don't know if he wrote that or not, but it gives you the DM a lot to fill in the blanks. So even as a pre-written module, the DM has to flesh out towns and NPCs and decide, if there's who shows up again and who's just kind of window dressing, and but there's enough there that you don't have to spend hours and hours customizing, But we had a really good group of players that were engaged and really dug into the storyline going on there. So we had a lot of fun with that.
Very cool. Daniel.
I mean, you can't go wrong with Scooby-Doo, right? Salt Marsh is so fun. I'm going to say, which is probably one of my favorite modules, period, is White Plume Mountain. I know a lot of people hate this module, but I think it's one of my favorite ones to run because it's like the epitome of the weird funhouse, but it also has like lots of legends going on. And the last time I ran it, which was in 5th edition, they were going in to get these weapons, spoiler for White Plume Mountain, but like I used all the environment. There's like a bone dragon and hags and all sorts of stuff to kind of help set the tone of it, which really just works. It's like D&D at its finest to me. Like that's the stuff that I like. I like traps that aren't just like I roll to find it. They're weird. You have to think about it. There's ways around everything if you think it out. If you just try to go into it with muscle and die rolls, you will fail. And that's one reason why, like when I ran it, I told them, I'm like, this is 5th edition, but don't think like that because I'm not going to use those rules. Like we're going to think about this like it was 1st edition because I played in some other games that have converted to 5th edition, most notably Tomb Horrors, which is dumb in 5th edition, but amazing in 1st edition. So you have to understand why a module was created, I think, in order to run it properly. And now I'm patting myself on the back. I feel like I do. I love White Plume Mountain. It was one of the ones I had when I was a kid. And it's just such a fun module to run. It's so weird and interesting. And you get the most powerful weapons at the end, but they still make you make kind of like moral decisions at the end with the weapons, which I think is pretty cool. So that's why I like that.
Have you read the novelization by Paul Kidd?
I did. Yes. And it's really funny too, because at first I was like, wow, this guy's really like poking at this thing. But then I like how in the end he has to do old school to succeed. So I do like that.
Yeah, he's his torchbearer that he hires. He's like, what are you doing with all the guy's got like this 10-foot pole and like gear just literally hanging. It looks like a Rob Liefeld drawing. And the main character is a ranger is like, what are you doing with all that stuff? So you need this to go into a dungeon.
Yeah, but he did need it though in the end, which is the funny part. Actually, that in that novelization, he has that was like a werewolf that got skinned, and that's his cloak.
Oh yeah, it's his.
I actually kind of use that. Yeah, it's a hellhound. I kind of used that, but a bear. And the thing, I used that idea of it and had a talking bear cloak.
And then he did. He followed it up with Queen of the Demon. What was it? The Drow series.
Right. Yeah, I haven't read those ones yet.
And it still is like, is this a satire D&D or is this?
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to tell because I think everybody thinks their D&D is going to start out serious, and by the end, it's always a Monty Python kind of.
Right, exactly.
Well, I mean, rumor has it that those initial players, they played a very Monty Hall style campaign, as shown by all this gear and stuff and powerful magic items you get at the end. Because that's kind of, I mean, it's very much with the fiction. A lot of the high fantasy, you get the big MacGuffin at the end. You get the powerful weapon or magic item at the end. So
yeah, and I think that the trick to any of that really is to not take away the bad that comes with the good. And I think a lot of DMs will do that. They'll be like, that sword's too powerful. Yeah, but are you taking into consideration that now spoiler, this person has to murder someone every day or they're going to be taken over by the sword. And actually what my party ended up doing was they gave the sword to the person that was the worst with it, because they were like, if he gets taken over, we need to make sure we don't die. So they gave it to somebody who was terrible with the sword. So it was kind of funny how that worked out.
That's awesome. It reminds me, it's really cool that I think that old school style, there's always like a moral dilemma, even in these, and they make for memorable adventures, just like you said there, Daniel. Like I know in an old Al Qadim box set in the Ruined Kingdoms, you get a very powerful blade called, I'll spoiler, Breaker of the Ninth Chain, but it's cursed in that you kill those who are close to you. And actually in the first combat, since we used to use that old critical failure table from Dragon magazine, like the person who was wielding it killed one of his bodyguards. So it makes it super memorable, right?
Yeah, right.
So I was going to add before Jason answers, because he never answers this question. It was Dead Sun's Adventure Path, not Dark Sun. I'm thinking probably Athas Dark Sun. Sorry, and then Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh was written by Dave Brown and Don Turnbull. It was part of that U1 series. So Jason, what's your favorite pre-written?
So I don't know, it's my favorite. The thing that my memory is not the same as it ever was, but the one that sticks out the most to me recently, and the one I've run for a couple different groups. And Carl was in one of these groups, but it's actually a different group that played it that I'm going to cite as the best session. Yeah, sorry about that, Carl. But this is a module by Terminal Games, and the author is known only as Zog, Z-O-G. But this is a DCC funnel, Dungeon Crawl Classics funnel, Blackout and Crater Valley, and it's set in the 80s. And I know I've talked negatively about funnels before. I think funnels are great for a couple different things. I don't like to play a funnel all the time in Dungeon Crawl Classics. I think a funnel is a great way to launch a long-term campaign. And I think funnels are great for some weird one-off things, not necessarily to show off Dungeon Crawl Classics, but like in this, where it's set in the 1980s, so you're not playing, in a fantasy world, you're playing like in a modern world, I think, and you're playing a horror, it's supposed to be a horror movie, a slasher movie, the funnel really works well. The one thing with Blackout and Crater Valley, I think the threats are a little bit underpowered. We never really lost as many characters as we probably should have. So if I was going to run it again, I'd probably up the threat value just a little bit. But it went really well with both groups. With the group that Carl was in, it went really well too, because both times the people, instead of playing their four characters that they had assigned to them in the funnel, 4 0-level characters, instead of just playing them as nobodies, they really gave personalities to each character and really got behind each character and did a great job with it. But prior to running it for Carl and his buddies, I ran it for a group across the pond. And I know I'll forget somebody if I mention, so I'm not going to name the names of the players because I didn't write them down before this interview. But they all did a great job of really inhabiting these characters, and they played them all as like little punks. So they like ran from the police as soon as like the police showed up, and they didn't have a problem doing mischief and doing things in the town. And they really got the concept, playing, it's in the 80s, and we're playing, these young hooligans, and we're dealing with this horror thing, and it just went really well. The module's not perfect. The module definitely needs another editing pass. And like I say, the power level could be upped a little bit, but I had a really good time with that. And both groups I ran, it went pretty well. But that first group, it just went just about perfect because they really just accepted the premise of the module, accepted the premise of their characters, and just ran with it. And, even to the extent where they were willing to, if they had to stab each other in the back to do something, they didn't have, it worked really well. So I think that's the one I would probably have to cite, in recent memory that I ran.
Cool.
But let's move on to the next question, which is, which pre-written module, and I know it seems like we're picking on pre-written modules, is there a pre-written module you could cite as your worst experience? And I guess we'll go back to our original order, so we'll go back to Daniel.
Yeah, so what I'm picking here is I'm going to say it was my worst experience in a way. I mean, it was a great game. We enjoyed it. But just when I look back on it, I ran Anonymous Subsurface Environment, which is very cool. And I didn't realize as I was running it that this is not like many OSR games. I've talked about this before. There's not nearly enough loot in this module, and there's way too much space with no loot. So we played for almost a year and barely anybody leveled up. And I could tell there was a lot of frustration in the players. It just wasn't, you'd go into rooms, they'd be like 100 silver pieces on, the far enough in that they should have been getting 5,000 gold pieces to really get the proper amount of leveling. We played like 50 sessions. And I think maybe one or two characters got to 4th level. And and part of that was when people weren't there, I would run separate adventures, and usually those were like homebrew things where they'd find a chest of 2,000 gold and they'd get this back. And near the end, I switched over to silver for experience points, like Lamentations does, hoping that would help. It just didn't. So I think it's my fault. If I was going to run it again, I would, because I love the world. The world is super cool. If you don't know anything about this, it's like a post-apocalyptic, and the clerics all worship basically satellites. It's like very cool. That was amazing. The amount of treasure in this module is terrible. So you either got to run it like DCC style, like, each encounter gives you experience points, or up the treasure dramatically, or, just do it some kind of other way, like X number of adventures. I know you've been talking about that a little bit, Jason. So yeah, otherwise, I mean, the module is great. It was really on me, and the players actually didn't want to stop playing. I was kind of like done with it. So I kind of moved on, but that was it. It was really much like, White Plume Mountain hit that real sweet spot for me, because I think it was really how I like to run. This was not what I liked. And now I know what I like. So if I was going to run it again, I would make some changes and it would be pretty cool. But yeah, it's pretty good. And I have the next 2 levels of it, by the way, which I've never run, because it's you can get them, I think, on Lulu. There's 3 books. There's one is just the first level in the town, and then there's 2 more levels. But I looked and there was like 5,000 rooms. I'm exaggerating, but in the next couple of levels, and I was just like, you know what, guys, we're wrapping up. Because I was just over it.
Yeah, I've got those. I haven't run them, but it's definitely a fun read. Yeah.
I should also add too, because there's been some conversation about this recently about mapping. This was one of the first ones where I really had my players map, and they really got into it. And they would be great. Like when they were leaving, I'd be like, how are you leaving? They'd be like, left, right, turn twice, go up the stairs, do this. And when they did that, no encounters. You're like, boom, you're moving full speed. If they said the wrong turn, I'd be like, no, you ran into a wall. They'd be like, what? And it was super fun, and they really enjoyed the strategy of mapping it. So I'll give that.
That's cool.
Yeah, very cool. BJ?
Probably the and I'm not really, it's not a bad experience in terms of people were having fun, but the introductory adventure that comes with Mongoose's Traveler, 2nd edition Traveler, it's meant to be an instructional module, which you should probably play the pre-gens and then just give people the option to tweak the pre-gens, because they're kind of made for the module. We went through the because it was all experienced gamers. We went through the full process of character generation. Spent like 4 hours doing that before we ever played. And so I thought like maybe the characters that came up, a lot of them weren't a good fit for the starting point of the module. The other problem with the module, and finally about halfway through, I had to say, guys, this is the introductory module designed to teach us the rules. So just accept that it's a railroad and stop getting creative, because they were really, it was like, well, we can go explore the galaxy. And I'm like, okay, but let's finish the module and learn the rules of how the game works. And I think one of my criticism of it is when everybody thinks, Traveler can scale to just about any kind of sci-fi. It can do planetary sci-fi. But when you think Traveler, you think sci-fi, but particularly think Traveler, you think I'm going to jump on a ship and go explore, or run a trade route, or fight some space pirates or something. The first thing that happens in this module is you cause the character's ship to crash, and you don't give it back to them until they complete the module. So they got to borrow ships from other people to run all these side missions, and I was like, so it just didn't. If you had somebody who had never role played before, they'd be like, "Oh, this is really cool." But when you pull some people who kind of already know what the game's about, they just there to learn the particular rules of this particular RPG system. It wasn't it was a little too linear and a little too, I guess, forced in a lot of places.
Yeah, that sounds like something. Oh, sorry, let me turn to it. That just sounds like something that you throw on somebody in the middle of a campaign, so that then all the things they did to that point, the friends they made, the enemies they made, they would have to use that, right, to get ships and stuff. If you start that way and you have no history, that just feels very forced, like you said.
The problem is when you have 6 players and 3 of them muster out with their own ships.
Oh, yeah.
And then I have to say, time out, guys. You're not supposed to have your own ship for the start of this adventure. Let's figure out what we're going to do instead. So it was just, again, I should have just gone with the pre-gens.
Yeah.
And but so we all had fun playing it, but I don't think it was a very good. A little bit of error on our part, but I think it could probably be a little bit better written module. But then again, the first module they usually make for any new or revised system tends to be very, I think, linear and
Correct.
you know, they're trying to demonstrate the system, and sometimes players don't want a system demo. They just want to get in there and push all the buttons and flip all the switches and see what happens.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's very
I
exciting.
wonder, do you think that's, oh, God. I was going to say, I wonder if you think that's true for the big box products like Traveler and D&D and stuff, more so than like indie games. Because I think a lot of indie games expect that you are experienced role players when you pick them up. I should say like OSR games, like Clones. Whereas like Traveler, if you're picking up, that could be the first time you've ever played a role-playing game, right? So that intro module is like the same is true for the Call of Cthulhu. What's that one? The house that you get. Like if you're experienced role players, that module is really pretty bad, you know. But if you've never played anything, yeah. So I think that's probably why. Like I think maybe the bigger role-playing games are targeted at somebody who's never played before. Yeah.
Well, that's definitely the case for like that the new Marvel playtest, the Marvel Multiverse playtest, right? That
right.
That initial module's horrible.
Oh, the playtest. Do you pay for that?
I did pay for it. I had to mortgage my house to find the $9.99
Nice.
Yep.
I can't find mine. I have the one with the Scarlet Witch on the cover.
Yeah, well, who's not even in the game?
Oh, and you have alternate covers.
That's right. Yep.
Right.
Nice.
Okay, we're over.
It's funny you mentioned Marvel. Oh, good.
Go
Because that's another game where I think you really should use the pre-gens. I learned that when I went to play Marvel Superheroes. When Stan Lee passed away several years back, I dug up my old box set. But then everybody was like, no, I want to play the Thing. I want to play Iron Man. And I was like, okay, cool. And no, those modules are, oh, there you go. Those modules are made for those characters, right? If you're not playing like Mr. Fantastic, you're not going to have the right things to do the thing that you need to do. Yeah.
Right. No, you need to play the characters included in the module. Yeah, right. Each module is written for specific characters, definitely. Yeah, and I'm going to touch on Marvel when it comes to me, but I'm actually going to let I don't want to jump ahead of Carl.
Yeah. Well, you can. Doesn't matter. But I already know I can tell you which one is my worst pre-written experience.
Oh, well, go ahead. Tell us.
So it was the newest Tomb of Annihilation. Right? It just did not go well. It didn't end well. It has some great ideas, and I know there's things I would definitely do if I played again. The first thing is get rid of that death curse. I wanted to run it as written. That's kind of what the players wanted. They wanted the 5e vanilla experience. And okay, well, this is the death curse. And it just, well, one, it didn't really, it was kind of a side note, really. It was never really manifest or made apparent in the game. It's kind of mentioned, and then it really, because the characters then go into the wilderness, so you never see like people in town die and can't get resurrected, right? Yeah. So I mean, I think it starts you at third level to do that. But maybe what I would do, I think, is to start at first level in like the frontier town that you get teleported to in the beginning of the adventure. And I think it has some good parts. You could spend a whole campaign, probably non-written and non-linear, in the jungle, which is great. But they do have a story that kind of pushes you towards this death curse thing. And eventually, the big disconnect for the players, and I think it's never really premised or hinted at. I think they could have like smaller dungeons where it's not just a 2-room dungeon to fight monsters, but there's a multi-room dungeon to do tricks and traps, which they never really do. But when you get to the tomb, it's literally all traps. And that was just like, for players, honestly, players who this is their first kind of D&D experience, which I'd say would be 3/4 of the players that I had in the game. They're like, I don't like this. I always want to fight things. Right? I just want to run up and fight things, or I just want to run up and attack it. I want to attack the trap, and then the House of the campaign ended because one character wanted to interact with the trap and got killed. So, right. So then people are like, I don't like this anymore. And that does have my worst experience. I feel like we had a lot of fun in the jungle and in the city, but once you got to the end game, it just was a huge disconnect.
It's kind of like you signed up to play Risk, and then the guy hands you a Rubik's cube at the end.
Right. Yeah. You really like, okay, we're gonna fight the big bad, but you can't find the big bad because you got to deal with all these tricks and traps, right? So,
yeah.
And I think that's frustrating for players. It's not premised enough, and I think they could do that. You could do that with that because I really, literally, I can't think of any of the small encounters out in the jungle where you're given a hint. This is what you're gonna have to do.
I feel like they tried to do two homages at once with that one. They tried to do an homage to the Isle of Dread and an homage to the Tomb of Horrors in it,
and Forbidden City. Right?
Yeah,
all three together.
Yeah. And I ran that briefly for some people. We didn't get to finish it. We just got to do one session. They just wanted to run the tomb, so they made higher level characters. And I just said, "Your Harper, you work. The Harpers have transported you here because here's the premise with the death curse. But this is why you're here. You got to go in here and stop the bad guy." They had fun with that. They didn't have to wade through all the other stuff.
That's so interesting. I haven't played it, but it's funny. Like when I ran my long running 5e campaign, one of the things that was happening in the background was all the high level spellcasters were being abducted. So we would ran through the entire, like the very first mission they went on was related to that. And then every town they went to, there'd be somebody missing. You go to a dungeon, there's somebody missing. So that all along they understand that, because the premise was by the time they got up to the higher level, they were the only high level spellcasters in the entire world. And then they were basically the target of the attack, So but you have to pepper that stuff out. You can't just like, here's a thing, because I think players won't get it, in a campaign anyways.
That's a homebrew modification of a pre-written adventure. That what you just explained, right? It's like someone got that and tweaked it so that it would fit and get rid of the plot holes. Makes logical sense.
But I think the modules don't. At least the big thick modules, and I can only refer to like things like from Coriolis and some of the other stuff I've read, that not the 5e ones, because I've not run any of those, but they seem to expect the DM to follow their module. They're not telling you to do this stuff outside the lines. Like, this is what's going on. So it's like if they had said, there's a death curse, figure out how it works for you, that makes sense based on what you're saying, but they don't even say do something with it. That seems a little bit odd, but yeah, I haven't run the module, so I can't say.
I've noticed they've shifted to shorter length modules or to anthologies of here's some adventures you can string together as a campaign or just flop them in. I think what a lot of those,
Saltmarsh, right?
Yeah, because I think what a lot of those, their original idea to have these sort of mega campaigns and kind of compete with Paizo on the adventure path model, their plot lines kind of fall apart, and some people do fine with them and other people don't. It really depends on what choices the players make. But sometimes, we had a lot of fun with Storm King's Thunder, but there's a couple of real big plot holes, or there's a couple of things where if they don't veer left instead of veer right, or if they don't, it violates that. I know like part of the Gumshoe was sort of a response to Cthulhu. The guy that did Gumshoe saying, if a clue is vital to advancing the adventure, you just need to give it to them. Don't make them roll for anything. Don't obscure it to the point that they might not ever find it. And there was a couple of puzzles, Storm King's Thunder. Let's go to the crux of, okay, this moves you from the first half of the campaign to the second, where it just, I ran through that as a player and we struggled to figure out what the puzzle was, and then I ran it as a DM.
See, I think both of those philosophies are wrong. There should never be anything that is the crux of the module. That's the problem. Yeah. There shouldn't be one way to do something. You should be able to miss a clue and still succeed. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with pre-written stuff that's really tight. Like looser stuff, I think, is better because you can kind of look at it and interpret. But the tighter they get, it's like, well, you got to go through this door. And if the party can't get through the door, then I guess we're stuck, right? That's just stupid. And it is, right? But if there's 5 other doors they could encounter, I don't think you should put something in front of the player they can't solve, but that shouldn't be the only way to get to where they get to.
Right.
In my opinion.
I agree with that 100%. I definitely, and I've done that before with written modules where I've just veered off the written module. And so, at some point the players, turn left instead of right, then now we're just running with it. Right. And if it ends up the way they want it is written, fine. And if we don't return to the written module, that's okay too.
Yeah. I just read, okay. Oh God, what's it called? The dwarf module from Limitations of Flame Princess. Have you guys run that one? Because everybody raved about, oh, it's amazing, the dwarf lore. That part's cool. That module is terrible. There's multiple places where you literally need to do multiple steps that the players have no way of knowing what they are in order to get past things. It's like dumb. It's like, how could you even, it is impossible to do the way it's written. I like pages and pages explaining, well, they've got to take 2 steps to the left, then walk to the right, then, reach down in their pocket and pull out a gold coin. It's like, how would they even know this? It's not written anywhere. There's no clues. It's like a terrible module, but the lore is interesting.
Yeah,
I think what it's called, Dwarven something. You know what I'm talking about? Hammer of the Gods is what it's called.
Well, we encountered in I've been playing in a Pathfinder 2e game that was it's Age of Ashes, and we got to the end of the first book, and you're supposed to discover, spoilers for anybody. The point is you're looking for this lost ring of teleportation gates that can allow you to access all over the Pathfinder setting. But initially the only way to get to it is you have to get past a monster that is like 2 to 3 levels higher than the party could be at this point. So you just can't beat it. It's, particularly if you're running 4 characters, they say this is a game for 4 characters. And I think the authors wanted you to bargain with it, but the instruction to the game, because our GM felt so bad because we lost like half. It's like the instructions that are given on how to role play this creature makes it very difficult for you to negotiate with, because you've just curb stomped a bunch of bad guys on your way in, and here's this last thing, and he's like, bow down and worship me and give me all your worldly goods. And what are players are gonna be like, screw
not
you.
Gonna do that.
It's like expecting players to surrender, right? Normal, so they get captured.
Well, the thing is, you can do that though. I think it's possible to do that kind of stuff, but you've really got to telegraph it. Like, have them walk in the space. So this is why old school games are nice, because most people have henchmen, and like the person just literally disintegrates the henchman, and then they look at the PCs and they're like, "Give me your gold." Now it's like, this person's capable of disintegrating somebody with 1 hit, so you can make a choice. But it's just some dude standing there in a game that's meant to be balanced. It's like, yeah, why would you not fight them? That doesn't make any sense at all.
Right. I've seen that work well. Go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
Oh, no. Actually, what I wanted to do in the spirit of time here, I know Carl's going to have to leave soon because he has a prior commitment. So what I'd like to do is throw the final question to Carl and let Carl, and then, so our final question was, so we're going to jump ahead a little bit and we can circle back, but what's your favorite homebrew adventure that you've run? Out of the adventures you've written and the things you've created, what's your favorite one? Which one worked the best for you? And then if you have any tips for people about homebrew adventures, we'll let you roll with that, Carl. That way,
okay,
because I know you have to leave.
Yeah, if I can go.
Thank
you. Although you guys have to press Jason for his least favorite pre-written adventure too.
Oh, Jason's trying to get out of it. That's what he's doing here.
No. Carl's on a time crunch. Right? I'm looking out for Carl.
Yeah, but just to talk about what BJ and Daniel just talked about a bad monster. There is one adventure path that did that really well, and that's the Shackle City adventure path, written way back by Paizo for 3.5. In the initial adventure, they had an iconic. I think if you have an iconic monster that the players know kind of through player knowledge, historically, this is a badass monster. Don't mess with it at first level. Then that could really work, and that's what Shackle City did. I'm not going to give the total spoiler. That did a great job. I mean,
I'm keeping a list of what we're spoiling so I can put it in the show notes.
Okay, good.
But the adventure path has a lot of other problems, but the first couple adventures for that adventure path are pretty good. I did one of my rare TPKs that I had in the second adventure for that adventure path. But so the best homebrew I've done, and I think Jason, if you were able to play this, was Varus's Folly. Mm-hmm. and the recovery of the last eagle. So it was like a 2-part adventure where I did a generational thing, and it was the background was the Teutoburg Forest massacre that the Germanic tribes did upon three Roman legions back in AD 9 or so, and the characters were all there, and it worked really well because not all the characters were legionnaires, right? So Jason's character was in the Legion, and I think Colin Green's character were in the Legion, but the other characters were like part of the entourage of the Legion. And I mean, I thought it worked well because I had an outline and I had the historical backdrop, and I knew what was going to happen, and maybe some of the players did too, if they were, but they didn't have to, and it worked really well. I thought it worked really well, and the characters didn't even have to survive. Some of them did, but my plan was that they didn't necessarily have to survive because my contingency was that relatives of Zareth would take up the mantle in the second part of the game, which was totally my own thing, and recovering the last eagle, because it's like a little obscure note that they recovered the last eagle after this time period, after Caligula's father Germanicus beat up the Germans again, out of revenge, and they found the last eagle, but it doesn't say how. So I kind of use that little blurb, to run with this, and I guess that would be my tip. I think Daniel alluded to this already. Find something in literature, find something in history that's very obscure and not well documented, and then expand upon it and run with it. And I've done that not just with the Roman thing, which I ran for Call of Cthulhu Invictus, but I've also done, and it's been successful, and I'm running it again. I'm doing an adventure with the backdrop of the Battle of Towton from the War of the Roses, where there's so much obscurity about the War of the Roses, about that battle, because so many people participated and so many people died. So that gives you a lot of room, like what the hell was going on there? Because it's huge. It's like, and it's like the biggest, bloodiest battle in the history of England, which is a long history, right? So I think that's my advice, is to take bits of history, look into the newspapers, and find little, blurbs about something weird or obscure, and run with it as a homebrew.
Very cool. I guess we'll go to anything else you want to add. I know you're going to have to drop off at some point, Carl.
Yeah, I'm gonna listen for a little bit, and then I got to go.
Okay. Well, we definitely, if we don't get to say goodbye to you because somebody else is talking when you hop off, thank you very much for participating. Carl, of course, has the Geomologist Presents podcast that his wife Amy kindly lets him do, and she'll graciously appear on as well. And it's a great podcast, and people definitely should go listen to it. So we'll go back to BJ to talk about his favorite homebrew game that he ran.
My favorite homebrew was a few years ago. I was playing around with a random online. It was a random deity generator. And I was like, well, for fun, let's roll up a pantheon of deities and just see like what name it generates and what because historically deities don't have their portfolios are not logical. Poseidon, he's the god of the sea, but he's also the god of horses for some reason. They don't have those neat boxes. So this one would kind of give you these random, and I'm like, okay, well, how would I create an explanation for these deities where they would do that? And so out of that brew, there was just this one that didn't fit. It kind of came up as, this is the god of zeal and something. And I'm like, this god just doesn't fit. And so it just inspired me to have the idea of, okay, let's say this is the interloper deity, and he's slowly taking over. His worship is taking over. And from there, I created this sort of Athens-like city. This is cultural mecca. Although it was D&D, so it wasn't really ancient world. It was still more of a fantasy medieval. But that is, here's this city that's stood forever, and it's the greatest city in the world. And, this is the home of philosophers and scholars and higher virtues. And this cult basically burns it to the ground in a night. So we start the adventure with everybody as first level as they're just citizens of the city, and we have a couple little running around town, running messages and things like that, and then this assault begins on the city where these cultists let this army in through the gates, and they start burning everything and taking over everything, and so the populace flees, and so the campaign is you've got this caravan of people trying to get on the other side of this mountain range to just resettle. And the adventurers are kind of their scouts and their outriders and their, but it becomes a bit of a hex crawl because they've got to veer off from the campaign and go, well, where did those raiders come from? Or what's that smoke over there? And we had some fun with that because I didn't have to predefine hardly anything. I could just say, I've got a general kind of idea of the terrain. Here's this valley, here's these mountains, here's this river that runs down. They built this city next to the river, and you guys are headed in this general direction. And hey, look, you know that there's a dwarven keep over there. Could you go over there and get supplies or negotiate, an alliance with them? Or all the orcs you encounter are coming from this direction, so they must have camps over there. What are you gonna, So that was a lot of fun because we could just make it up as we went. And there was no pressure to conform to any. Well, here's what the book says the next step is. You could just say, well, what would be some fun? Now that you guys are third level, what would be some fun encounters for your party? And I mean, it was more balanced than say sort of the traditional hex crawl where it's just like, oh, that's a dragon's lair, run away, But that was a fun campaign. It didn't last very long, but it was kind of a short-lived one, but it was fun.
Oh, very cool. Daniel, do you have go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sure. No, that sounds really cool. I like the idea too that you've kind of mixed this like randomish kind of thing with still a big overarching like plot, right? Like you have this idea, they're still going somewhere. Because I think that's the problem. Sometimes people will create this like, well, the player's mission is to do this, or the PCs, so they have to create every step. But if you just have this general idea, like they've got to get them to safety or whatever, then anything could happen. And that can be very free flowing and very, very rewarding for sure. Yeah, I like that. It's pretty cool.
It's like Battlestar Galactica, but it's D&D.
Right, exactly. We're the last humans alive. Every planet they land on. Look, more humans.
Mm-hmm.
That feels like a game right there.
It's definitely a game. Yeah. Daniel, your favorite homebrew that you've run?
Oh,
if you have one.
God, it's so hard. They're all my children, and I love everyone equally. Mm-hmm. But if I think of something that I probably had some of the most fun playing, and that I've actually, because I'm notoriously I don't run things more than once, but I've run something that I call "Do Space Dragons Breathe Fire," and it came about because I did the Kickstarter for Leopard Women of Venus, which was a DCC supplement. And it's based on this weird artist, Fletcher Hanks. Mm-hmm. And it made me buy Fletcher Hanks' cartoon book. And in there's this whole series where this guy, I forget his name, Star something, is like going from planet to planet. And whole series, it's like 3 comic strips. And it was so weird and bizarre. I was like, this is going to be a game. And then at the same time, I was talking to Andy Goodman. I don't know the reason why. I was thinking about what would be the weirdest thing that a dragon could breathe. So we had this whole thing going on, and I created this thing where they're basically going onto this planet, being sucked there by this like evil genius. It's like very cartoony, and it was a very silly game, which is not normally what I run, which is also probably why it's so different. But it's so fun. I ran it in DCC, and it was so over the top. It was a high level DCC, like 9th level or something like that. So like. At one point, one of them cast a sleep spell and like slept everybody from like 700 miles or something, and they had to be permanently until they were kissed awake. So they had to go around to each of the PCs and kiss them. Like it was just crazy stuff going on with evil geniuses and stuff. And one of the reasons why I did it was because DCC has great dragons. But then I ran it again at GaryCon in Chainmail. And when I was like, okay, there's 1,000 space imps attacking your ship. And I just and I was like, you have a laser blaster on your ship. It shoots 2 handfuls of dice. Like people were just throwing dice on the table and any sixes or kills. And it was just this crazy mayhem of just silliness that I just think it's such a fun way. It brought really the joy of just like being silly back, which I think sometimes when we're trying to be all grim, dark, we don't get that, right? It's not a very serious game at all, but it's really fun. And it allows people to just get into it and just be goofballs. So I think that's probably one of my favorite things. Now I'm pretty much going to run it at any convention now because it's such a fun convention game. Yeah.
Well, that's a great answer. I think if I had to pick one, unfortunately, I don't know that pretty much all my homebrew campaigns have fizzled out before they actually got to finish, which is sad. But I think of the one of the ones that was a lot of fun. It didn't quite finish, But when ICRPG, when Runehammer Games came out with Altered State, which is their cyberpunk game, I back when the quick start was out, before the full game was out, it was just out to the patrons. I started a campaign of that, and I actually started 2 parallel campaigns. I had a game for British European players that was like my afternoon, and American players in my evening, and we were running them the same day. So I like game at like at 2:00 and like at 7:00 at night, right? And the American group, for whatever reason, kind of fell apart after 2 or 3 sessions, but the European group went on for a while longer, and that was a lot of fun. They were in. I had a whole background story, and the bad guy was actually roughly based on, and actually I was using the name Mumra from the Thundercats, but not that name. So that was like the anagrams of Mumra were in like the code and for this and secret things, and they're trying to. There was a secret book and cultists involved, but they had like this highway battle where they're kind of like the Matrix, where you're driving on the highway and shooting between the cars. They had a highway battle, and they had an adventure in the jungle, and they had scenes where they were like brought into a police station, like left in a room, and they had to figure out how to escape the police station, and they ended up where the game stopped. They were actually in a ape city, a city almost like Gorilla City in the DC Comics, in the jungles. And they were going to end up the next adventure, which we never got to do, was going to be a time travel thing where their minds were going to be projected back to like apes and chimpanzees in a laboratory in the 1980s, and they would have to find something in those bodies and bring. But that was a lot of fun. We had nobody ever figured out the Mumra anagram. I included it in different spellings, like an anagram. Each adventure, but yeah.
If DC would just embrace the pure silliness of the DC universe for their movies, they'd be a lot better off. Who doesn't want to see the Flash have to deal with a city full of super intelligent gorillas? I mean,
right. Well, they did that somewhat with the TV shows, right?
Yeah, the TV shows did it. They just were like, this is corny, let's just enjoy it, and it worked.
Did they? I only watched Arrow, and that was kind of dark.
Arrow stayed kind of dark, but the Flash and Legends of Tomorrow and some of the other ones they got.
Oh yeah, I didn't watch any of those.
Yeah, they Titans is pretty dark too. Oh, that's HBO Max, not CW. But I'll tell you what's really dark, and now we're off the subject totally. But and then no spoilers yet. But I'm watching season 4 as we're recording this. I'm watching season 4 of Stranger Things, and it's really dark. I don't remember the previous seasons being that. I mean, it's like
no.
This is
full on horror. This season's a full on horror movie.
It's a full on R-rated horror movie. It's not like you don't sit down with your kids and watch this. Seriously, I would not. I wouldn't have little kids watch this at all. You're gonna give kids nightmares with season 4 of Stranger Things. It's really dark.
Well, that probably makes sense, right? Because the kids are getting older, right?
Oh yeah, the kids are all like junior, senior. Well, they're all in high school, and
D&D and the Satanic Panic are the
the Satanic Panic, D&D.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, that actually turns me off a little bit. I'm going to be honest. I felt like the D&D references have been so ham-fisted in Stranger Things after the first season that I just every time one happens, I cringe. I'm like,
oh, I did in the first episode. So this is it's not really a spoiler, but in D&D,
oh, you're totally spoiling.
But no, they make a horrible mistake, or not horrible, but it's set in 86, I think, right?
Yeah.
And the one character in the show talks about how they play
they describe
half-elf rogue,
with a kukri.
Yeah, with a kukri, right? But all the books are AD&D first edition. I mean, and there's no rogues in first edition AD&D. Yeah. Now the word rogue existed because it was in Tunnels and Trolls back then, but it wasn't in AD&D.
Yeah.
Well, so it was a first level thief.
What's that? Oh, well,
first level thief's title is a rogue.
Correct. I apologize.
But,
you're right.
But her character's a 7th level.
Yeah, she was not a first level character. Though.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
We're way up in the weeds now.
Anyway, yeah, we're way in the weeds. But I mean, if you like it, it's worth seeing. But be advised, it's like R-rated horror movie dark. It's a dark show.
Well, Stranger Things makes good grist for the problem with Stranger Things. It would make a great campaign, except probably all your friends have watched it.
Well, and
at least enough of them that they'll go, "This is Stranger Things."
So let's pull that back a little bit because we talk about inspirations here. So let's talk for a minute about inspirations for homebrew games. I know personally what I've done a lot of times, especially for one shots, but also for I won't talk about the Cyberpunk at all because I've taken inspiration from different media sources for the Cyberpunk game that Daniel's in that we're going to pick up at some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to tell me, for the secrets, I'm ready. Let me get my
Okay.
notebook out.
Okay, well, let me lay it out for you now. But I've done pickup games a lot of times, and honestly, I go to westerns a lot because the themes in your old westerns are almost, you can use in any genre for the most part, right? A lot of them. But I've run a lot of games where I'll watch a movie or a show, and obviously you change things up, and but you take the inspiration from that and turn it. And that's what I do for my homebrews. I'll get inspiration from here or there, and then riff off it. You don't try to mimic that exact thing in the game, but you kind of riff off that for the game. But Carl gave us some ideas of tips for writing your homebrew stuff. So let's go to Daniel, because I bet you he has an idea or two on tips for writing homebrew stuff.
Oh yeah, I do. It's interesting you say that, because I think that's the important part, right? Like if you watch Stranger Things, which I haven't seen the newest one, but you watch the first one and like the kid gets disappeared right into that because so long ago, you could use that and not make it obvious as Stranger Things. I think you can get the idea from it. And that's a lot of times what'll happen. I'll be reading something and I'll be like, oh, that's interesting. That one thing, like in the Witch World series by Andre Norton, there's like they don't even go into it that much. It's kind of like a tangential thing that there's a whole town or civilization, whatever we call it, that lived in this this near the sea where there's a lot of storms, and they make their entire living from salvage. So because of the laws of the sea, like ships try to pass through here, and whenever there's a large storm, this town all goes out the next day in small boats and recovers the salvage. Like that's what they do. And I was thinking, that's an amazing thing to have in the game. You could use that as there was something on the boat you need to get before they do, or maybe they already have it. Now you got to negotiate with them, or maybe you're trying to get past them and then maybe they're pirating and not just salvaging. You could take that one bit and turn it into an adventure, depending on what your players like, which is what I think is important. And, and what you like, obviously. I think the premise is there. Once you drop something out there, like I never have an idea of how I think I have an idea of how I think they will. I don't have an idea of what they should do. If I put a evil, vampire running a thieves guild, if they could kill the vampire, they could join the thieves guild. I mean, it could be any one of those things, because I think seeds are much more important than plot, I guess. So for me, I'm just constantly pulling things like that.
I'm the same way. To me, when I prep a game, I come up with a world and your major players, and I want to know the major players' motivations, their goals, things like that. And then I'll riff off of and I come up with the initial incident, and then I just riff off what the players do. And because the idea is to know that NPC bad guy well enough that you know how he might react, or so you can kind of anticipate how he's not anticipate, but once the players do something, how would he probably react to that? Okay, now we're going to go that way, and not so much. And I know that sounds bad, like, oh, well, you're gaming against the players. It's not that, because the bad guys are going to screw up too, but you're not plotting it out. You set that. The idea is you come up with a problem and then you stop because you don't want to come up with a solution, because you don't want to discount. If the players come up with a good idea, you want to be able to roll with it. You don't want to say, no, I've thought it, because I've already thought it should be handled this way, I'm not going to go with what the players want to do. If the players come up with a cool idea to solve it that's plausible, hey, let them try it and roll with it. And if it works, great. You don't want to hamstring the players because ahead of time you thought of how it should be solved.
Yeah, and I think I actually spend more time or more precise writing when I'm writing like a one shot, when I know it has to be done in one session, than I do with them that's going to go for a while. Because if I'm writing something that I know is going to go for a while, I will be very loose at the beginning because I want to see where they go. If it's a one shot, I do like, okay, well, we know they're going to have to go here. And I will tell the players that. I'll be like, in this adventure, this is before we start out of the game, where you're going to be hired to go kill this wizard in this tower. And that's basically what you're supposed to be doing. And make characters that want to do that, because it's a one shot, and that's kind of, that I think that's important.
Yeah, I agree with that. Good.
I think the homebrewing really, and what I really rather see if I'm going to pay somebody for published material is, I'm going to give you a location, and here's the world the players find when they stumble upon this location. What it is tomorrow depends entirely on how they react. If they take no action, maybe here's what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen if they don't do anything. But the minute they start messing around and getting involved, things change. And I think it's good designed adventures start you in a place where you know what's happening today and what's going to happen for the foreseeable future if nothing occurs. But then the players get to totally screw that up, and it doesn't box you in to the point that you're like, you guys went off script. I don't know what to do now.
Right, and I can, and they're good adventures, and I should be able to give you examples, but I know in the 80s there were plenty of adventures out there that are, so this is the villain's plan, and this is the timeline. If the players do nothing, this is what's going to happen, right? And they give you that timeline, just what BJ said, but then it's up to the players to, you to give them enough information for them to, figure out something to get involved. But once they get involved, to screw that timeline up. But it plots it out, the timeline. So, and then you just riff off that.
Well, I think some of the top secret adventures, I mean, that's not the genre of D&D, but I think some of the top secret adventures were like that. It was like they're event based, right? It's like at this day they do this, at this day they do this, at this day they do this. And you got to stop them somewhere in between or catch them when they're trying to do it. That's kind of the idea.
Right.
But yeah, I think you make a really good point. What the players do is super important, and you have to lay it out. And I kind of alluded to it, or maybe I said earlier, that like when currently I went off script because I finished all the Hyperborea modules, and I have all the main NPCs listed. And then at the end of each session, when I stop playing, I sit down and I write a sentence under each one of exactly what's going on. If they interacted with the player characters, how they feel about them, where they are. If they didn't interact with player characters, what were they doing? Where are they now? What are they thinking? What do they know? Because the NPCs don't know what the GM knows. And I think that's one of the trickier things to be able to pull off. It takes a little experience to really be able to look at a thing and be like, okay, no, they wouldn't know the players did that because they got away with it. Or they would know the players did that because they were, too bold or whatever. And also executing on what will happen if the players don't do something. I think if you don't do, that's kind of like what I said before about the magic items. If you, baby your players, they'll get used to just not doing anything and having things handed to them. But if they go, well, we're just going to hang out in the tavern tonight. Oh, really? You heard the screaming across town? You're going to stay in the tavern? Yep. Okay, well, you get up in the morning and now the mayor's dead, So it's like, there you go. You let him die. Now figure it out. It's like you allowed that to happen by not acting. And now you've learned that. And, hopefully.
Dan DeFazio, who is runs the Dungeon Craft, Professor Dungeon Master, he has a good solution for that because he runs a medieval world. And he's like, when something bad happens in a medieval town, the first people that get accused of it are the strangers that nobody knows.
Yep.
So there was a murder and you were staying in the tavern and all the locals are like, well, it's not him. He's been my neighbor for 20 years. It's got to be you.
The reverse of that, it's really interesting. I don't know how much you guys watch Runehammer, and this would be an old video, or that he might have just talked about this on his Patreon-only podcast. I don't remember, but he talked about setting up a scenario where it's a world where you have witch hunters and things like that, right? Or they would hunt mages. But anyway, the characters roll into this town. And the town's kind of, really locked down, and you have like, you have what's the word I want? You have like Inquisition kind of guys. They're on the corner with soldiers, and there is a tavern that's open, but it's the spirits are down low and everything, and that the characters looking out the window at night and they see they're erecting a gallows and or it wasn't a gallows, it was a thing to burn somebody on. Like a funeral pyre, not a funeral pyre, but like to burn a witch on. And then the next morning when they wake up, they show, and there's a teenage girl, a young girl, or I think she was a preteen girl, but anyway, a young girl was tied to this thing they were going to set her on fire for witchcraft. What did the characters do, kind of thing, and to set it up. It was a really dark thing, but it's you're the stranger of town, and you could do nothing, but what party's really going to sit there and do nothing in that situation?
Well, I mean, if you ham-fisted it, that sounds a little ham-fisted. I mean, he probably obviously spent a long time doing it. It's probably more to it than what you said.
I use a lot of short.
That feels very ham-fisted. As a player, I would not try to save her. I'd be dead. You got an entire town there. I'd be like, well, that sucks. But, but if you instead had people talking about it in the tavern, if you saw her being, she was manacled outside, she was being whipped, you could inquire, people could beg you, things could happen. Maybe you got a letter that said this was going on. That's how you came to the town. I mean, just having that happen, I mean, as much as it sucks, I wouldn't do it as a player. I'd be like, yeah, that's why I don't play paladins.
Right. There you go.
Could you see like if you got a cleric in the party, the girl's family sees you and is like, oh, you're a part of the clergy. You can speak to her, please. She's been Save my
Right,
daughter.
maybe you can exercise it from her, something like that,
Yeah.
Because if you don't you got to give players bones. I mean, you really do, because most players are going to think that you have some idea of where you want them to go. And, we usually have some idea. So you want to be able to be like, well, yeah, exactly. Somebody, the family comes up to you and they're like, oh, maybe you could save her or whatever. Or maybe that you're asked, you're a fighter, and they're like, oh, you're one of the whatever the different bands are and groups are, you should help us with this because we need guards. You involve the players somehow. But if they just like, we're just gonna go sleep, I mean, that's one thing. But yeah, I just, that feels very ham-fisted, but it also feels very one-shotty, right? Like, we're gonna play tonight with new characters and this is what's happening. And that's a different situation than I mean, I actually had a very similar thing happen in my Astonishing Swordsman campaign where people, they didn't know exactly what was happening, but they let somebody go because they were in a situation. It was like, there was like 12 archers on horses. There was only 4 of them. They didn't know their strength, and they know me well enough to know that they might be strong. And there was potential for people to be killed. And they didn't do anything because they didn't know if they could survive it. And why would they? They just met these people. So I think that's part of it. They have to understand that they're not always going to be able to win. So that's a real choice. Do we save this person now? Or do we look for a bigger problem? Like, what's really going on? Why are they being, why are they being accused of witchcraft? What's going on here? Because maybe that's really the plot.
Right. And I'll link to what I can, like, say, it might be, if it's only on his podcast, it's a patron only thing. And I kind of shorthanded that a little bit.
Yeah,
obviously the idea is, you would set up, but this was back also when he was really big into doing miniatures and setting up because he's a big DIY guy. And back when Runehammer started as Drunken Dragons, it was a lot about doing the, props and doing the miniatures and all
like paper minis and stuff, right?
Yeah. And setting up the battle board so you'd have interesting things for them to interact with, things you can, things on the table they can interact with and do. And that was part of it too, was setting up where, so you have bad guys on this corner, you have a card here you could use to throw over for cover, you have this and that, and talking through like setting up a battle board for that scenario too. So there was a lot more to it than what I kind of said, but but it's interesting. So here, but you throw this up there and you see how different GMs, how Daniel reacts to it. He's like, my players aren't getting involved. And
no, actually, see, the way that I would get my players involved in that is one of them would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. They would be that girl. She magic jarred them. Now the player character is trapped in that young girl's body. This player's got to convince the rest of the party that to save them, because otherwise their mind's going to be destroyed. Right now, they have a real reason to do it. And of course, this is the kind of thing that you got to know your players, that they're not going to like throw the table over for you doing that. Or what I would do is make everybody roll. That's usually what I do there. Everybody roll a die. And whoever the person that rolls that 1, guess what?
Yeah, and
now
that's
playing
not
this little girl,
right?
Yeah,
that's awesome. BJ, if you're playing a game, one of my games in the future, be prepared to be magic jarred. But I'm
okay,
a kid.
Magic jar is such a great spell.
I think the idea too is the characters aren't like the equivalent of first level D&D characters either. You're rolling in the town and you're pretty, you're powerful enough, hopefully, to handle the situation. But
if you are, why would you ever attack? Again, I don't know. I am not a well-versed in ICRPG, but any D&D character, let's say an OD&D or a BX, that could take on a town guard is powerful enough that that's not a problem at all, because they would just teleport her out or something. Like it wouldn't be an adventure. So I don't see how that exactly would make anybody that I play with do it. But again, it comes down to your players are at the table to play. And if they know that's what they want you to do, they might do it if it's not a campaign. Maybe they're agents. Maybe they're agents to figure out what's going on. Maybe they're witches, right? Maybe the magic user, and you don't tell all the other players, you just tell the magic user in the group. You actually are coming to this town because they've been killing witches, and this girl is very important to the coven or whatever, blah, 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 and you do that. But you got to give them something,
Yeah.
You can't expect them to be heroes all the time.
No,
or, more like a Conan thing where it's like some noble is like, my daughter has run off and we've discovered she's in the small town, but they've accused her of witchcraft. Go bring her home safe.
Yep. Yeah, that'd be really good.
I don't care how you take care of it as long as you get her back safe.
Yeah. But what's interesting about this is it kind of goes into what we started talking about, which is exactly that, right? You gave that little bit of an idea, and then that inspires different GMs to run it differently. Like what I would take from somebody being tied up is this is how I would do it, so that it would make sense to work as a one shot or as a campaign. I guess Coriolis does this, and I think it's very ham-fisted. That's why I say it's like in the spoiler for the campaign. At one point, they're just like, somebody from your family is one of those people that's kidnapped. It's like one of the player characters. It's like, oh, okay, so we don't have any choice. There's no agency. It's like literally that's what it is. Nobody
I hate
even
my
said they
family.
had this person. Right, but I'm also like, you didn't make a character that had a family. Like all of a sudden now that player is responsible for having to have this family member and what their relationship is, and that just feels very forced unless it's told before anything happens. When you're making a player character, it's like, well, I didn't make a character that would, have a family or that would have this or would have, what if they all made people play families that were far away? It's like, well, how would we justify this being here? So I think you got to be careful with that if you're in a campaign, because people want to control the characters more. In a one shot, it's one thing. You can just be like, who wants to be the person, that.
Definitely. So think about now. Personally,
did we
I
move
think
sideways. I think we did. I'm not even sure.
We did, and that's okay.
What was this podcast about again? I lost it.
We were talking about time travel.
Yeah.
This is the time travel podcast. But no,
Jason, you've got to go back and name your least favorite. What did Carl say? You couldn't let you wiggle
That's
Oh,
away
yeah.
Speaking of time travel.
Yeah. So speaking of time travel, we're out of time, folks. Thank you for. I don't know that I don't run that many pre-written adventures. So the ones I've run have generally gone pretty good. I mean, not perfectly. And the ones that have gone wrong are mainly my fault, to be honest. I think the worst one, and this is super predictable, was the first one I ever ran, which was trying to do Day of the Octopus, which was the one that came with, I believe that's the one that came with the Marvel base set, right? With the basic, the yellow box, the 1984 Marvel set. And that was because that was the first time I ever tried to GM. That was my first GMing experience, was that, for some cousins, and it just didn't go well at all. But that was, because that's the first time I ever did it. And it, just didn't go well.
I was amazing right out of the box. My first one was.
I think and I really don't remember if I got Marvel superheroes or, the Menser basic set first. The Menser basic set, I still think is the basic set, things are compared against, right? That's still the gold standard for how to do a basic set. There's some other really good ones out there now, but
I don't know.
For the time frame, though, you have the introductory adventure. You have.
I'm not a big fan of that. I don't like that, because this is the reason why. Now I'll tell you why. Then I'm going to get attacked by the Beck.
No. It was good.
But I think it's a great way the first time you read through it. But I think that the book loses its value after that, because I feel like Mulvey does a better job at kind of explaining how to play than the Choose Your Own Adventure. I think it's a good idea, and I understand why they did it. But I think after that point, it's kind of like the Palace of the Silver Princess, the redone Palace of the Silver Princess. The first 5 rooms are like a Choose Your Own Adventure style to teach people how to play. But I still think Keep on the Borderlands does a better job, as does B1, because it's not as easy to jump into, but it's reusable. It's like, okay, so I did that Choose Your Own Adventure. Now, how do I do this again? I got to go back and look through that. I just don't think it's as strong. That being said, I did not have the Menser box set. I've just only read that first part because I was curious about it, and everybody loves that cleric.
Right.
But I'm a hardcore Morgan Iron Wolf person, so I'm not gonna.
No, that's fair. And I didn't get BX till later in life. We never had BX as a kid. I went Menser to AD&D, and then we played AD&D, and then I got away from D&D before second edition that ever came out. So
no, I'm of course I'm half joking, because that's the set I started with. Whatever set you started with first is the best set.
Well, I agree with that. And there have been some really good starter sets since then. Yeah. Pathfinder had a really solid starter set, and people say good things about the Call of Cthulhu. It'll be interesting what this Pendragon starter set's going to be like when it comes out. Because
that'll be one more Pendragon thing I buy that I never get to play, with my big stack of Pendragon. It's so attractive, and I can't get anybody. I don't know. I shouldn't say that. I don't take the time to read through it to get everybody to play it, because you got to know the system, right? You got to build your families, and you got to,
I've got everything in print for the latest edition, the last edition Pendragon, the 5.2, and I plan to do it someday, probably as a solo thing, but just never
solo.
Never got around to it. But
well, if you run it, Jason, I would take part, because I also have all of that. I got it as a part of when I did Paladin. Did you do Paladin?
Yeah, I've got those too. Yeah.
Beautiful books, but
you mentioned even if you're not going to run published modules, or read them, and I the dungeon I've been running, I've only done 2 sessions, just solo play, just exploring the OSE rules. It's actually King's Harvest, the old one of the old basic line. And King's Harvest has some very good. It's designed as a module for first dungeon master, and it has some very good practical advice on running things. And I was amazed at some of the advice he gives, even stuff like with clues. Tell the character who has the highest intelligence score that it occurs to them that, or tell the player with the highest wisdom score that they hear this off in the distance. It's just very make it make sense for the party and move on. And it's not hidden behind dice rolls or chances of failure. It's just very I had never read it before, and I was like, well, I'm gonna run this one, set it up in Fantasy Grounds and just run it. I'm like, wow, this guy, I can't draw a blank on who wrote it because I don't have a hard copy, but very good, just practical advice for a new dungeon master. I think would still apply today, even if you're going to run Pathfinder or 5th edition.
Are you recording the actual play?
Yeah, the two I've done of actual play, where it's just me describing them going through the dungeon crawl. It's the dungeon from King's Harvest. I dismissed with all that because I was just focused on let's look at the mechanics of old school essentials. Advanced.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it King's Harvest or Queen's Harvest?
It's King's Festival. That's what it is.
King's Festival. Okay.
Yeah. Queen's Harvest is the follow-up.
Gotcha. So the author is Carl Sargent.
Carl Sargent, yeah.
Okay.
I tried to record myself doing a solo OD&D just to kind of using strategic review, and the party got all the ways in. They got a bunch of gold. We're on their way back out. Random encounter with 3, I think, sorcerers who sleep spelled the entire party and killed them. Because first level party, right? It's like boom, boom. Yeah. No, they weren't sorcerers. They were something. They were like 3rd level magic users, and actually the party got initiative, and they killed 2 of them immediately, and then 1 survived, and that one that survived, boom, sleep spelled the whole party, cut their throats, and that was the end. I TPK'd myself.
So that's not a reason not to publish it, Daniel. People still want to hear that.
Oh yeah, no, I'm going to do it again. So what I did was just like what I would have done when I was a kid. I just went, well, the whole party died, so we'll just start over. It's like I only went a little bit into the dungeon. I rolled it up. Yeah.
Well, when your next party goes in, when your next party goes in, they'll find the bodies. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah.
One of the things that I didn't know where it fit into the questions we had, but I know when me and some of my friends played around with the Fate system a few years ago. And one of the things I appreciate about Fate that might be useful if you want to run other role-playing games is Fate breaks the narrative system down of a role-playing game into a very digestible. When you start thinking about, okay, here's the scenario, and here's everything of any relevance is an aspect of the environment. Was there a cart there you could hide behind? There's an axe. You write it down on an index card. And that kind of taught me a way to structure how to describe environments and how to think about, okay, here's what they can interact with. But also because it's so player driven, it kind of teaches you to get out of that. No, you can't do that because that's not here. If they say, well, is there a door out of here? Well, maybe there is. I mean, even if you're not going to give players that much control, I think it gives you a little bit of every time a player comes up with an idea, you think, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to write that down. and even though I'm not going to make that an aspect of the current scenario, like maybe that's on the other side of the next door or around the next corner. But I felt like it just sort of helped me start to think about how to track ideas that players come up with, player suggestions and their expectations about what the world is like, and to not be that DM who's like, no, this is my world, my story, and you're going to conform to it,
Well, that's actually, and this is probably a whole other podcast, so I won't get too deeply into this, but this comes down to that idea too. And some of it comes down to virtual tabletops where like people like to describe everything in the room to players. And I feel like if you do that too much, or you have little icons in the room, that people don't think there's anything else. Like you're saying earlier, talking about that setup, like there's a wagon there, right? Mm-hmm. But if you didn't say there was a wagon there, could there be a wagon if the player was looking for it? And if there's 2 wagons there and the player goes, is there a 3rd wagon? Do you add that? I'm guessing no, because you've already put your wagons there. So it kind of comes down to however you think about how you want to play the game. Sometimes you want to be more strategic and like, war gamey, which is how I say that. But sometimes you just want to be like, somebody's like, is there a puddle? There might be. Let's roll. Is it logical to be a puzzle? Maybe I'll give it a chance, right? Can can I knock the torch off the wall with my sling stone? Sure, let's try that. But if did I even say there was a torch on the wall? No, but they're assuming there's one because that's dungeon dressing that the players imagine.
Mhm.
So like, I think that, right, you can go both ways on that, right? It's like, it's nice to give them that freedom, but that comes into description. So that's probably a whole other subject, but how much do you describe and how much don't you describe, I guess?
Well, right. Because, there's that train of thought. And of course, now we're talking more theater of the mind here, right? So let's get away from the idea of, well, is there a picture of it in the VTT or not? But theater of the mind, right? When you enter a room, especially if you enter a room and you enter into combat, you enter in that room and there are orcs that are playing, they're throwing dice at the table and one of them sees you as you walk in the room. At that point, the characters aren't sitting there looking all around the room, taking everything in. So when they enter that room, you might describe it, there's that table there, there are 3 orcs sitting at the table, rolling dice, there's a doorway on the far wall and a bed in the corner or something. But the player, but that's all. And the players go in, they deal with the orcs, but then they want to, or if they, like you say, they ask, well, is this in the room? Or when they search the room later, there could definitely be other furniture, other things in that room, because you're not going to describe everything in the room, because really they're not paying attention to that, because their concentration should be, you would hope, on those potential hostiles in front of them, which might not even be hostiles. Maybe they'll parlay with the orcs. You never know. Maybe they'll say, hey, can we join the game of dice, right?
And what I think is interesting about that too is that the assumption that certain things are in the room or not, it becomes more fixed the longer we play. Like I find when I play with new players, they're always asking stuff. Like they're the ones that look under the bed. A seasoned player never looks under the bed, but the new player is always like, I'm going to look under the bed, because they're just thinking, what would I do? Not like what's mechanically, where are there normally secret doors? Like, how do I do this? They're thinking outside the box, and or inside the box, how you want to look at it. So we become jaded and stuff. But yeah, I think it's interesting you say that. If the orcs are playing dice, you definitely want to play with them. That's the right move.
Oh, well, yeah. That's why I say that option should always be there, though. It shouldn't be they're orcs, we're going to kill them. I mean, maybe you're going to kill them. I don't know. It depends on the situation. But and that's what's great about the older games, especially. And to be fair, some of the newer games, I think in the middle, in the late 80s, by the late 80s, we got to this point where we're going to charge in and kill them for the most part. But really early on, and now it's changed again especially with things we won't go into on this podcast, but which are good, the re-looking at things because of potential prejudices in building the games that may or may not have been there. But, there's more likely a chance of people talking to the creatures nowadays. And there was back in the day, right?
Well, I think it's how you teach people, right? And again, now I don't know about this. Now I got to look at the Minster thing to compare it. But if you look at the Mulvey example of play, when they encounter the hobgoblins, the first thing they do is try to trick them and talk to them.
Right.
That's exactly what they do. They don't attack the hobgoblins. They try to talk to them. It's the very first thing they do. And I think that teaches you when you're playing that the first thing you should do when you encounter hobgoblins is try to talk to them, because that's what the book says to do. And I think
when all things being equal, there's a reaction roll,
right,
with sentient with creatures where, I mean, logic dictates if you're invading someone's home base, they're not going to be happy to see you. If they clearly see you're a stranger. But if it's just these random encounters, well, even the reaction roll, you can go, well, a bad reaction roll, they recognize you're not supposed to be here, but maybe they're more curious and apt to ask you why you're here, as opposed to just roll for initiative and start shooting arrows at you. Between that and between reaction rolls and morale checks, it creates a very different type of what's possible, where the players don't know that, well, it's not, I don't have to kick in the door and kill everything what kills me, because it may not attack me. It may react differently.
Right, 100%. And I think you can get players in any system in any way that will play that way. And if the referee works in that system, it'll work. But I think that certain systems imply certain actions,
right,
by not showing the other actions, which is, I guess, the same argument that somebody could use against OSR games, saying they're not good for role play because there's no rules in there for that, right? But the reality is, if you don't have rules for reaction rolls, if you don't have these kind of things, then people assume bad guy, kill, right? And then that's generally the normal reaction that people have, the normal reaction the GM or a player will have to that situation.
And it's interesting though, because a lot of that comes, how do you incentivize players? do you give XP for killing monsters? If, arguably then you're encouraging killing monsters. But then you look at a lot of the games, the early 80s, a lot of those games, Bureau 13, and I want to say the Palladium games did this, and other games, a lot of the games had just a chart, you get X amount of experience points for these actions. And usually in there, we're solving an encounter with non-combat. So solving encounter without combat would be more experience points than solving an encounter with combat, to incentivize the idea of trying to figure out a way to do that.
Oh, right, exactly. I think that's really important. And I think, not that I'm a scholar by any means. I don't have lots of years in, as a scholar. When you look at OD&D with the 3 little brown books, right, you get a ton more experience points for killing monsters. And as soon as Greyhawk comes out, they lower it. And what I assume when I look at that is I say the early players just killed everything because they wanted those experience points. So he wanted to stop that. I've actually found it works well because I play with players that don't do that anyway. So, but if I had never played before, that's what I would do too. I'd be like, oh, there's a bunch of experience points for killing a goblin. Why wouldn't I kill them? But when you make it 5 experience points, now you're risking your life 5 experience points, not 100 experience points, right? So it definitely changes the dynamic. And I can see why they did that in Greyhawk, although I do it the other way still, because again, I have players that don't just attack everything. So I don't have to worry about that. And I like the experience points being higher for combat. Well, higher at the beginning and lower at the end, because if you look at like a dragon, right, a dragon probably gives you like 800 experience. Yeah, they're 8 to 12 hit dice, 8 to 1,200 experience points. But in most games, a dragon might give you 5,000 or 6,000 experience points, where a goblin gives you only 5. So you want to kill a dragon, it gives you a lot of experience points. But in OD&D, a dragon could kill you really easily, and they're only worth eight goblins, So it's like, you don't want to kill that dragon. You want to get the hell away,
Right.
Yeah.
And the easy way to fix that, of course, even in your older games, is to just say, if you successfully negotiate the encounter, maybe not negotiates, maybe not, if you successfully get through the encounter with the creature, you get the experience points, whether you kill it, whether you negotiate with it, whether you, sneak around them, whatever you do, as long as you deal with that encounter, you maybe you get those points, right?
Yeah, which is how DCC does it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So most of the places I've seen advice on running, I can't think of where I've ever seen where the instruction to the DM was to deny the XP for the encounter if they don't fight the monster.
Well, but you have games that you explicitly get XP for. You have games. Which edition was it? Whoever lands the last blow gets all the XP for that game, for that creature. There are games that do that, where actually the character that actually does the killing blow gets the XP for killing the creature, right?
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess on a surface level, 5th edition does that, but not really, because if you actually read the rules, you just have to, solve. I forget how they say it, but they don't say kill the monster. You have to defeat them or succeed against them or whatever. So it could be any number of things, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
so you don't have to do that, but most people look at it and they go, "Oh, orc 500 experience points. That means kill orc." I mean, that's how most people think of it, especially coming from like a video game. Especially younger people maybe that have played video games and not role playing games, or I guess older people.
Well, if the DM sets it up that the most expedient way to solve an issue is to kill the monster, that's what they're going to do. They're going to gravitate towards the simplest, easiest solution.
Sure.
That still gets them from point A to point B.
Right. And of course, this all comes also down to like different styles of games. If healing is more readily available, if spells come back faster, if rests are shorter, then combat becomes less of an issue. So then it's faster to use combat to solve the problem. If you have to leave the dungeon for a week to heal, you don't want to fight unless you absolutely have to, because you want to get as deep as you can. So all that kind of ties in together to create a certain play style. Well, it feels like you're getting 2 podcasts out of this. I'll have to charge you double my rate.
I'm gonna have to.
That's okay.
I'm gonna have to run in a minute because I've got.
I think we've answered. We haven't, of course, fully explored the topic of homebrew and pre-written adventures, but I think we touched it on a good bit, and we gave the listeners some bonus content. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel. Thank you, BJ.
No problem.
Of course, we thanked Carl earlier. BJ has the Arcane Aliens podcast, as I said. Daniel does the Bandit's Keep Media Empire. He has multiple YouTube channels. He has multiple podcasts. He has products for sale. So I'm going to let you guys, I'll throw it to BJ first, and we'll let Daniel close out since he's our guest. Anything you want to plug, or anything we last minute you want to say, BJ?
Nothing really to plug other than just say I think this is a great conversation, and I think I prefer homebrew. I've been through a phase in my life where I haven't had a lot of time for it, but it's really my preferred way of doing things. So, and I think it's not as hard as I would encourage people not to be intimidated about it, because there's tons of resources with blogs and podcasts and books and advice for GM and YouTube channels and things like that. So you poke around, you can get some good advice from people who've done it before to stimulate your own thought processes and stuff like that.
Yep, definitely. Daniel?
I think that's a good point. I think also that this is maybe a little outside thing, but I think people need to be less worried about that, right? I mean, what's the worst thing that can happen, right? If you run an absolutely terrible adventure and it kills everybody in the group, you could just be like, that was a dream. No, but people you could try stuff. I mean, assuming that you're playing with your friends, you just say, hey, I wrote an adventure, I want to try it out, and gain that confidence. If people want to homebrew and maybe they've been afraid to, just do it. Be honest with your friends. I'm homebrewing. We're going to see where this thing goes. And yeah, I think most people are pretty receptive to their friends trying things out. So, yeah.
I agree with that. It's very rare your players are going to tell you that was hard. I mean, if their character dies in the session, they might be a little bit salty or something. But for the most part, players are going to be pretty positive and pretty supportive of the GM and what they're doing, because they know you're putting a lot of work and effort into this, and they're showing up to play, and so they want it to go well. And if the social aspects of the game session go well, that makes up a lot for even if you have problems with the mechanics or problem with the adventure. Because think about, you guys talked about the worst pre-written module you had, but because you and your players were joking and having fun at the table, it still wasn't a horrible experience, right? Everybody left that game session having fun. And ultimately that'll be the same thing with your homebrew, especially if you're playing with your friends. So, yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. If you have any comments or thoughts on this, you can reach out to us. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a note in the YouTube comments. If you're listening to the podcast, you can use the Anchor app to leave us a message. You can go to the podcast website and leave a message. You can send an email to cerebrivore@gmail.com and leave a message. So if you leave us feedback, we will play it on a future episode. If you have specific comments for Daniel, we'll have links to his stuff in the show notes, or you can leave us a message and we'll reach out to him and get you an answer. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you all the panel members, and good night.
A nerd central broadcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the sign of Capstraw. All stars and pods past, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. The sun is blowing teeth, escaping your brain, baby. What I mean is this machine's a freak, and from what I understand, that's an evil. Don't look now, the Cerebral is coming, and all that's left, crying